So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth lecture of the Reading the Past series, organized by Paraspar by Office of Communications, Indian Institute of Science. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Raziuddin Aquil from the Department of History, Delhi University of Delhi, and he'll speak on political and cultural roles of Sufis in medieval and early modern India. Before we begin, we'd like to give a brief introduction of the speaker today. Professor Aquil's field of interest are in medieval Indian history, Islamic traditions, literary cultures. His long teaching career includes teaching subjects like problems of historical writing and methods, history of Delhi Sultanate, Mughal India, Bengal and Jaunpur, historical traditions of ancient and medieval world, philosophy and methods of history and forms of history writing in medieval India. He has published widely. His many books include Sufism, Culture and Politics, Afghan and Islam in Medieval North India, published by Oxford University Press in 2007. Warfare, Religion and Society in Indian History, co-edited with Kaushik Roy, published in 2012. Sufism and Society in Medieval India, Debates in Indian History and Society series. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2010. History in the Vernacular, co-edited with Partha Chatterjee. It was published by Permanent Black in 2008, and most recently is his book Lovers of God, Sufism and the Politics of Islam in Medieval India, published in 2017. We are very happy to have you, Professor Aquil. May we now request you to begin your lecture.
Thank you very much, Bethesda, for inviting me to speak here in your esteemed institution, even if online. And this series is very, very important and interesting. How the past has shaped the present is an important concern. And also how the present seeks to use or abuse the past is equally crucial. In either case, insights or lessons can be drawn for a better present and some hope for the future. In my lecture today, I will look at the critical significance of Sufi mystical movements in India, which is a living tradition, with its history going back in India to a millennium or so. The presentation will draw from a chapter I have written for a handbook, which is being edited by two eminent historians, Professors Ramya Srinivasan and Professor Richard Eaton. Richard Eaton is well known for his work on Sufism, and my own research is informed by his formidable presence as a scholar of Sufism in Punjab, in Bijapur, as also Islam generally in Bengal. Sufism has been an important strand of South Asian Islam historically. A large number of Sufi figures settled across the Indian subcontinent through medieval and early modern era. 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century is medieval here for my purpose. 16th, 17th, 18th centuries are early modern. So covering a long period actually from around 13th century to the 18th, and sometimes backward also 12th and 11th century, as I will give some examples from there as well. 11th century Lahore is a major center of Sufism under the Ghaznavids. So literature related to them has spoken highly about significant political and cultural roles played by them. Medieval and early modern rulers invoked popular religion and spirituality for legitimation of their power. Conversely, the spiritual leaders also intervened in matters of politics and governance, though boundaries were sought to be maintained between the political and the cultural, but the two could also intermesh sometime. Interactions between political and cultural domains have created conditions for general public weal through inclusive political theory and practice, as well as recognition of shared and pluralistic cultural traditions with a space for diversity and difference. This is the general character of our historical experience going back, a millennium or more. Sufism has contributed immensely to these processes, marking India's civilizational achievements with peace and tolerance as defining features, despite various kinds of contestations ranging from violent combats sometimes to shrewd political negotiations often. Some fine scholarship on Sufism by several accomplished professional historians in the past 5 decades or so, which I'm surveying as part of my own interest in historiography of Sufism, scholarship have brought considerable sophistication to the understanding of some of the critical roles played by Sufis in Sultanate and Mughal regimes. Sultanate period, 13th-14th centuries, 15th, and the latter half of the 16th century, 17th century under the Mughals, and 18th century is a long open field in large parts of the subcontinent, including regions of Punjab, Deccan and Bengal, as well as a number of other locations. The scholarship that I have been analyzing include older writings of Muhammad Habib and K. Nizami, Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi. They mainly work from their base in Aligarh, Muhammad Habib and K. Nizami, Nurul Hasan, S. Nurul Hasan. Newer writings such as that of, apart from Richard Eaton, Simon Digby and Muzaffar Alam. Muzaffar Alam has recently, brought out a book called The Mughals and the Sufis, Islam and the Political Imagination in circa 1500 to 1750. More recently, Scott Kugel has done some very interesting work, as is Niall Green. And of course, my own research is informing my presentation here. So, drawing upon several works that I have been, conducting as part of my own, career, starting with a PhD from JNU on this topic of Sufism, culture, and politics. That book from OUP. Sufis or Muslim holy men who styled themselves as friends or lovers of God, Waliullah, Baqabillah, were often charismatic leaders with popular appeal. They were known for their miracles and karamat. That's why people go on Thursday evenings to Sufi shrines, as also on the occasion of annual OoC celebrations. These Sufis were organized in silsilas or spiritual orders, branching into quite a few competing strands. Of the varieties of Sufi lineages, 4 of them enjoyed considerable importance in India. 2 of these, Chishtis and Sohrawardis, flourished in the Sultanate period, while the other 2, Qadri and Naqshbandis, became significant in Mughal India. Other chains of lineages included Firdausis in Bihar, Shattaris in central India, with their significant places in the history of Sufism generally through the medieval period. Though these spiritual lineages maintained their respective traditions, some Sufi masters also often transcended barriers by joining multiple silsilas. So they were not restricted to, one silsila or one Sufi master alone. They could, cross over. To start with, the living Sufi master, who were referred to as Sheikh or Khaja or Pir, or generally in popular parlance as Babas, they guided followers called Murids, or generally visitors at their dwelling places, hospices, which were referred to as khanqahs, which were bigger monastery-like establishments, as also Jamaat khanas, the smaller prayer halls. But later the shrines or tombs or dargahs of Sufis of previous generations became important and grew into places of pilgrimage. Ajmer is a major pilgrimage center for Sufi devotees. But eventually carving a whole sacred geography of Sufism called Vilayat. So the term is very, very interesting. It is about the spiritual aura or the Vilayat around the Sufis, and the territorial control associated with it. So vilayat, so spiritual and geographical categories are getting fused in the making of the sacred geography of the Sufi vilayat. This would therefore, this sacred geography would therefore involve a lot of struggle and competition for control of territory, followers, and resources. The leading early Chishti figures included the well-known, as I mentioned, Moinuddin Chishti of Ajmer. Qutbuddin Bakhtiar Kaki, whose mazar is located close to the Qutub Minar in South Delhi. Sheikh Fariduddin Ganj Shakar, who is venerated in the Sikh tradition as Sheikh Farid or Baba Farid. A large number of his banis and shaddas are part of the Guru Granth Sahib, and his successor in the Chishti Silsila, Hazrat Nizamuddin Awliya of Delhi, who is a very, very important figure, and his successor in turn, Nasiruddin Chiragh Delhi, who ran into difficulties with that infamous Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq, infamous for all his farmans of troublesome kinds. The comparable figure in the competing Sohrawardi order or Silsila was Bahauddin Zakaria, with his base in Punjab. Though Moinuddin Chishti's shrine at Ajmer received a lot of attention from Mughal Emperor Akbar in the late 16th century, visiting there annually for several years, walking long distance, barefoot in veneration for the saint buried there. But Akbar was also devoted to his contemporary Chishti exemplar Sheikh Salim of Fatehpur Sikri, close to Agra, where he, in respect for the presence of Sheikh Salim, Akbar even also shifted his capital. There were two other powerful figures in the late 17th century, as also in the 18th. The Naqshbandi masters, Naqshbandi Sufi Sheikh Ahmad Sarhindi, who styled himself as the Mujaddid al-Faisani, that is the renovator of Islam for the second millennium, as the first millennium of Islam had come to an end, and there was a lot of anxiety about how whether Qiyamah is going to be heralded and the world is coming to an end. So this man, styled himself as a reformer for the next millennium. More importantly, another Sufi from Delhi in the 18th century, and his family subsequently, Shah Waliullah and his sons, are known for their critical presence in terms of political intervention, in terms of reform within Sufism, and most traditions today of Sufism, as also Sunni Islam generally, have respect for Shah Waliullah and his family. Besides, every region has Sufi masters of considerable repute since the medieval period. So it's not merely about Delhi and centric, but as I said, Punjab, Deccan, or Bengal, or Central India, Bihar, there are Sufis with their region-specific appeal, and yet they were connected with the larger sacred geography. So what distinguished Sufism from other forms of Islam, as I mentioned, Sunni Islam, represented by Hanafi ulama, Sunni Islam of Hanafi ulama in the sense of following the Hanafi school of jurisprudence of Sunni Islam, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali being other schools. And then in the Shia tradition, there is a Jafri school of jurisprudence. Sufis are supposed to be expected to be somewhat different from these juridical forms of Islam, with their practice and emphasis on spirituality and cultivating the heart, etc. And therefore, it was their belief that a human soul could achieve union with God as part of the spiritual experience, which was later formulated in the doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud. It is a famous doctrine enunciated by Ibn Arabi. It's called Wahdatul Wujud, Wahdat Wujud, Al-Wujud. unity of existence or monism as a reality. So there is only one existence, as we know in Indian tradition also, Advait philosophy. Similar to that, to which I'll come back subsequently also. This doctrine often brought Sufis into conflict with Islamic orthodoxy, represented by Sunni Hanafi ulama or theologians, as I mentioned, of the Delhi Sultanate or the Mughal period, who emphasized on the unity of God, so Tawheed. So Tawheed and Wahdatul Wujud are perhaps not same, was the emphasis of the ulama, but the Sufis of the Chishti kind by late 15th, early 16th century are mentioning that not only Wahdatul Wujud is perfectly valid, it is in conformity with Tawheed of God, because God is one and God has created everything, and therefore everything has a hand of God and everything is therefore God, and therefore accordingly respected for what that thing is. Whereas the theologians believe that God was unique, and therefore to suggest that a human soul could achieve union with God was to imply that there was no distinction between God and human beings. It is for this reason that we find that even before Islam came to India, Sufis were persecuted for heresy. The case of Mansur al-Laj is particularly well known, who in an ecstatic, with surur, went public declaring that he is God, he is truth. Which is something which Sufis would also not approve of, that spiritual experiences are private matters of Sufis as experiences and not for public consumption. Sufis were also targeted by the ulama for their occasional indifference to formal religious practices such as regular congregational prayers in mosque, namaz or salat, Persian namaz, Arabic salat, instead focusing on meditations, spiritual exercises, and emotional expression of devotion for God, which included music. And I will spend some time here during my presentation on the importance of music in Sufi practice. Indeed, Sufi's contribution to the spread of poetry and music, which is referred to as Mahfil-e-Sama in the literature, as also Qawwali in popular parlance, is notable. Sufi orders such as the Chishtis used song and dance techniques for creating spiritual ecstasy. They also played a significant role in the growth and development of literature in a variety of vernaculars such as Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, Dakhni, Bengali, etc. that I know of. I'm sure other languages also have literature in those languages relating to the Sufis and by Sufis themselves. From as early as the 14th, 15th centuries, we see that Sufis have written in about their activities in these languages. Hindi is a vast field. So to come back to that doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud and several forms of meditation brought Sufis spiritually very close to certain strands of non-Muslim religious traditions. Now these may have emerged independently, or yet there are parallels and even interconnections between, say, practices of Sufis and practices of yogis, for instance, or concept like Wahdatul Wujud and Advaitwad of the Indian tradition. So similarly, for example, Advait Hinduism, as I said, claimed that Atma, a human soul, and Paramatma, God, were the same, a theory similar to Wahdatul Wujud. Similarly, Sufis found much to learn from Hindu spiritual disciplines such as yoga, which influenced their techniques of meditation, such as pranayama, or breath control. If Sufis learned from non-Muslim traditions, the latter were also powerfully affected by principles of Islam as represented by Sufi saints. In the teachings of Sant Kabir and Guru Nanak, for instance, one can see clear imprint of Sufi Islam. Kabir is very much a Sufi figure, but he becomes so syncretic in the sense of appropriating from diverse traditions that eventually he was sort of nowhere, and Guru Nanak goes on to be a central foundational figure in the Sikh tradition. Their criticism of idol worship and rituals, emphasis on equality and worship of one God, are all to be traced to Sufism in the manner in which Sufis were emphasizing and in their teachings. Its most significant contribution to Indian culture is the example it set in the field of religious and cultural coexistence, without demanding conversion, without talking in terms of identities of the political kind that we are concerned today. And yet we know that identities happened, conversion to Islam happened, and to which I will also come back subsequently. Indeed, Indian Sufi order showed that Muslim and non-Muslim religious traditions could prosper side by side and learn from each other. So conversion was not the only possibility. The Sufis dedicated themselves to the love of God, which in turn meant love for all his creations, which is translated into charitable endeavors, blessings and benediction, and notions of egalitarianism, service to humanity through feeding, langar, spiritual healing, which is referred to in Hindi as jharpuk, or blowing and touching, charms and amulets, ganda, taviz, etc., for which people go to Sufi dargahs on Thursdays, or almost they are open on weekdays also. Mostly people go sunset time and seek blessings and benediction, and helping them. The needy were considered better forms of worship than ritualistic prayers. Sufis also made a considerable investment in the control of the lower self, which is referred to as nafs, or both in the crude physical sense, but also in the sense of ego, and cultivation of the heart, qalb, through a variety of meditational bodily practices and withdrawal from this worldly demands, tarke dunya. And tarke dunya denunciation does not mean for Nizamuddin Auliya that one should, wear a langota and go to live doing tapasya in a jungle, but do tapasya here among the people and endure all the hardships where the recommendation. And in this context, an interesting comparison is drawn between Sufis on the one hand and madness of Sufis in their love for God, and the case of Majnu, who was mad in his love for Layla. So these were practiced with the same kind of intensity as madness of Majnu, and yet Sufis considered themselves superior to him. For the former sacrificed his life for a perishable Layla. Layla was to die, whereas Sufis devoted themselves for an eternal God, and that was the claim Sufis are making, that they are mad like Majnu, and yet they are intelligent in the sense that they are not going to waste their time for someone who is going to die. And there's an anecdote narrated by Nizamuddin Auliya to the effect that how, when Layla passed away, they rushed to look for Majnu. Majnu was spotted meditating in a graveyard, deeply sunk in thought about, meeting Layla, and he was told that how you are sitting here and Layla has passed away. So then Majnu was very angry that he was wasting his time for someone who is going to go. And therefore Sufis think that they are more clever, intelligent, that they are in fact in their death going to go to God, who is there forever. So in that madness or ecstatic love for God, Sufis could also sing and dance, not in a vulgar manner, but most aesthetically sophisticated forms developed through centuries of practice. When Sufis passed away, celebrated as marriage or union with God, which is the Arabic word urs for that, they left behind memories to be cherished forever. The shared legacy of Sufism, coupled with inclusive political practices, has shown that it was possible to address the aspirations of a variety of people, leading to peaceful coexistence in what is aptly referred to as India's famed unity in diversity. Now, in what follows, I will be highlighting some key features of the kind that I've already introduced, but contested issues and Sufis' resolution of important debates concerning Islam in Indian environment, with a few important examples from the Sultanate and Mughal periods. Before I do that, let me quickly introduce the kind of sources that are available for us to be able to speak about Sufism in a manner that is very intelligible, because Sufis themselves have produced a huge amount of literature in Persian and various Indian vernaculars, as I mentioned previously, and they are available, in manuscripts, in printed forms, in translations, etc., in a variety of genres. So the vast corpus of Sufi literature in Persian and vernacular languages included Malfuzat, or discourses of a Sufi compiled by a disciple, generally in the lifetime of the Sufi himself. Fawaid al-Fawad of Nizamuddin Aulia, his discourses is very famous. The maktubat, or letters written by a Sufi to his disciples, are important because these are literally written by Sufis, letters for training the disciples. Maktubat-e-Sadi and Maktubat-e-Do-Sadi of Sharfuddin Yahya Maneri of Bihar from the 14th century are very famous. Other Sufis also wrote many letters, and some of those letters have been compiled, and published. They have come down to us. Mystical treatises on Sufism prepared by a Sufi Sheikh included a famous text called Kashful Mahjoob from the 11th century Lahore by Sheikh Ali Hujbari Data Ganj Bakhsh from the early 11th century. As also Tazkiras, or biographies, hagiographies of Sufis, generally compiled after the death of a Sufi, but in many cases soon after the death of a Sufi. Someone like Nizamuddin Aulia has biographies being written out about him within 25 years of his death. Siyarul Aulia is a famous text by Amir Khuld Kirmani, written in 1350s. Nizamuddin Aulia died in 1325. Another text called Qawamul Aqaid, it was written in Deccan by a person called Muhammad Jamal Qiwam within 25 years of the death of Nizamuddin Aulia. These are sometimes speaking in legendary terms also, but Siyarul Aulia is very important in terms of providing credible information that can be corroborated by, substantiated by, in fact, quoting Nizamuddin's discourses themselves in Fawaidul Fuad. And there is also Akhbarul Akhyar from the late 16th century. It's a famous text in Persian by a Qadri Sufi and a scholar of traditions of the Prophet called Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi. Akhbarul Akhyar. It is once again very important source for understanding writing history of the Delhi Sultanate. Besides these, Sufi poetry of love, both in Persian and also in a significant genre of Hindi literature called the Premakyan. And one famous Premakyan was in the news a few years back. Malik Muhammad Jaisi's Padmavat is a poetry of love, which I think the filmmaker could not handle properly, and historians could not inform him either, and it made such a political mess of things. Besides these, there are other sources. Political chronicles are talking about Sufi activities, especially with regard to matters relating to Sufi's relations with rulers. Now, since I referred to Hindi Premakyan, I will just quickly mention that how in North India, this Premakyan genre became very popular, and Malik Muhammad Jaisi's Padmavat was not the only text. There are other from the 14th century. Mullah Daud's Chandayan is very famous. In fact, a huge amount of literature has been produced by Sufis in Hindi in North India, and Hindi literature, actually the classical period of Hindi literature in its history is the Mughal period, about which Ali Sanbush wrote a fine book. And the Premakyan genre, the Padmavat kind, has been studied in a fine piece of work by Ramya Srinivasan, whose name I mentioned previously in the beginning. Now, the Chishti tradition had established itself firmly in almost the entire Indian subcontinent already by the 14th century. The Chishtis were devoted to God, and their songs of love were presented as an essential form of worship. Sufis established their auspices not only in the big cities but also in many qasbah kinds of towns. So they were all over in Awadh, Punjab, Bengal, Deccan. Often contributing also to the clearing of jungles and reclaiming land for agriculture in projects involving legitimacy of emerging political regimes. So this is part of the work of Richard Eaton also, revenue-free land grants being given by the political regimes to men of religion. They were supposed to get that area brought under cultivation, and also therefore in the process establish their presence, the presence of the state, presence of the Sufi, presence of therefore Muslims. These all Muslim pockets would also be eventually emerging. So in this way, they created a spiritual following over a vast geography, embracing people who had or had not formally converted to Islam. Late in the 15th century, early 16th century, pilgrimage to Ajmer was a huge thing, and a large number of visitors to devotees to, as today, at Ajmer and many other places, were not Muslims. They were non-Muslims. They had not embraced Islam, but they had faith in the miraculous power, charismatic personality of the Sufi buried at particular places, as in the case of Ajmer. Early 16th century North India, the period in which Jaisi flourished with his Padmavat and all, witnessed a variety of developments. On the one hand, there was the vibrant religious and cultural impacts of Sufis and Bhakti saints. Late 15th, early 16th century is the time when Kabir and Guru Nanak also flourished. And on the other hand, a fluid political context charged with possibilities was emerging. The Mughals were coming. Babur's attempts to establish his Timurid or Mughal dynasty would be followed by Afghan resistance, especially one led by the formidable Sher Shah Suri, with Mughals returning to establish their empire in a firm footing with the help of the Safavid rulers of Iran. Though Rajputs were still emerging in the early 16th century, the so-called Hindu subjects may not have felt disenfranchised under the Afghans or Turkish rulers earlier, just as they would not under Akbar, and even under his successors, including Aurangzeb. No matter what we say about Aurangzeb's abuse of Islam and bringing a bad name to it, medieval and early modern emperors, nobles, scholars, thinkers, and men of religion, including Sufis, together contributed to the creation of a fascinating cultural field of civilizational scale. That's how a huge political entity, whole of the subcontinent, and economic well-being and prosperity, as also social harmony, were the defining features of the long medieval period, as early modern, as also early modern. So there is enough information in extant sources in a wide variety of languages and genres to explore and further discuss some of the interesting themes in some details. I have planned to quickly say bits on music, bits on the question of conversion and Islamization, bits on the Sufi Bhakti interface, which created and the political context, which created conditions for the plurality and diversity, etc., that we value so much. So on music, I've said previously also that how it was an important part of the Sufi activities, Sufi spiritual experiences, and even now and historically, wherever you go at a dargah of the Sufi, you'll find that the qawwals will be sitting and they would be speaking, singing, and chanting, reciting poetry of love. They could be reciting Quran, they could be reciting certain formulas, Arabic formulas, and then there will be some Persian poetry, and then the vernaculars, wherever, because Arabic and Persian is not the language of the people here. And so the language of the people is is used by Sufi fraternity in Sufi fraternity for the spiritual expressions, and in that context we also just quickly mention about the significance of Amir Khusro here, who was one of the closest disciples of Nizamuddin Aulia. He lies buried at the Nizamuddin Dargah complex. And he's central to classical Hindustani musical traditions in terms of his innovations and inventions of several forms relating to music, whether it is ragas or khayals or tarana or instruments like sitar and sarod, are attributed to Nizamuddin. And it is also interesting that how Nizamuddin Aulia would discourage that the fact that instruments are important, and he would say that how instruments are not required. A very fine love letter is enough to create ecstasy in Sufis. Why do we need instruments and etc. But the emphasis was that how a fine quality of poetry, recited or sung by a fine qawwal can create ecstasy to the extent that it can, completely transport the listener with a mature adult person in love with God, to God. So many Sufis would actually die listening to qawwali. Qutbuddin Bakhtiar Kaki, whose name I mentioned at Mehrauli, he actually died listening to qawwali for several days, and especially listening to one particular couplet, which sounded like this in Persian. It would be referred to is called Kushtagane Khanjare Taslim Ra Har Zaman as Ghaib Janiye Digar Ast. Kushtagane Khanjare Taslim Ra, the victims of the dagger of submission to the will of God. Har Zaman as Ghaib Janiye Digar Ast. A new life comes to that person from the unseen every moment. So there are many such lines which would hit, and would become very, very popular. So it was not about crude, dancing and music and created ruckus, but these were fine piece of poetical writings which were used for creating ecstasy sometimes. And then the Mahfil-e-Sama could be identified. There are discussions about it, identified as something as halal, which is permissible, or which is something is haram, completely abhorring, or something which is allowed, maybe mubah, and something which is completely abominable, makruh. So halal, haram, makruh, mubah, these are the forms in which musical practices were identified, and figures like Baba Farid and Nizamuddin Aulia and other responsible senior Sufi masters were careful in terms of their interest in music. Often this would lead to difficulties, as in the case of Nizamuddin Aulia's struggles with Delhi sultans, especially Sultan Raziuddin Tughlaq, who was threatening Nizamuddin all the time. There was a judicial interrogation inquest at his court, where Nizamuddin had to defend the legitimacy of his practice of music. Eventually, this led to a confrontation of the kind that how Raziuddin Tughlaq, ordered, issued a farman to the effect that Nizamuddin Aulia should leave Delhi, should go to maybe Deccan or Bengal or Punjab, wherever he would not be allowed to stay here. So in that case, most of you, I'm sure, have heard about it, called Dilli Dur Ast. So returning from a campaign in Bengal, Raziuddin Tughlaq had sent this farman to Nizamuddin, asking him to leave Delhi. So Nizamuddin said, Dilli Dur Ast. So what happened? Even before Raziuddin Tughlaq would come to Delhi, reach Delhi, he dies in an accident under mysterious circumstances, which perhaps involved his son also, Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq, the infamous one. Muhammad Tughlaq in turn created political hierarchy with all kinds of farmans of the outrageous kinds, of the kind despots revel in. And therefore, we know that the Chishtis really suffered after Nizamuddin Aulia died in the same year in which Raziuddin Tughlaq dies, and Muhammad Tughlaq takes over 1325. And after him, though Nizamuddin was already sending his disciples to Deccan, to Bengal, to wherever they could establish themselves in central India, but after his death, many Chishtis were forcibly, asked to relocate to Deccan. And one of the grounds was that how Sufis could, wherever they go, they could establish political regime and its power on a firm footing through its cultural, using the cultural interface, which would also mean that we should be thinking in terms of whether the political and cultural together work for conversion and Islamization, etc., or whether conversion and Islamization happened without an agenda of sort, because sultans were not really interested in conversion. The political ideologues were not interested in conversion. Raziuddin Barni is a famous 14th century historian, ideologue. He worked for Muhammad Tughlaq as a personal advisor for 17 years. He was also a disciple of Nizamuddin Aulia. Close friends with Amir Khusro. Amir Hasan Sizzi was a compiler of Nizamuddin Aulia's discourses. He would be completely disinterested against conversion of non-Muslims to Islam, because if all of them convert to Islam, then all of them will seek power, seek their share in power, and therefore, because Islam is supposed to be egalitarian, and therefore converts from other religions, irrespective of their social origins, would stake claims in power, and therefore someone like Barni would be against conversion. And yet it is important for us to talk about it. Often this is not the case. Historians are generally naysayers. No, political regime did not play any role. Ulama could not. Sufis were interested in social harmony. How could they be talking in terms of conversion and Islamization? But it is important for us as historians to know what were the processes through which conversion and Islamization happened over a long period, perhaps not Quran and or sword kind of hypothesis that is often talked about, but over a long period of 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18th century saw Islamic Islamization and acculturation into Islam of a large population of the subcontinent. Bengali Muslims are one of the largest ethnic Muslims, maybe only after the Arabs. So how that happened? Deccan is a major center. Punjab is a major center. Not so much Delhi and Agra region, which is, and that's makes it very interesting. Delhi Agra region, which was a center of Muslim political power of the sultans and the Mughals. Muslim population is not very dense and in terms of concentration. But concentration is in the margin of the large empire. So in Punjab and Deccan and Bengal. So those margins are important in themselves, as regions in relation to larger national. And therefore, we need to know the processes of cultural change and religious change in those parts. So what I'm noticing that is that how Sufis were actually not disinterested in conversion and Islamization. Texts like Siyarul Awliya of Amir Khurd, I mentioned previously, Akhbarul Akhyar of Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi have referred to how Sufis were interested in conversion and Islamization, but without using political power, ever. And if at all they wanted to use political power of the kind that that is often associated with in extraordinary situation of involvement of Sufis in the political, Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi kind or Shah Waliullah, they would still not be interested in conversion, even though their approach could be unfavorable to non-Muslims in extraordinary cases. But generally, Sufis are known to have created a condition where they would establish themselves at a particular place where a local population would be emerging, and over a period of time a large population has emerged, and that population claims that how their ancestors, as in the Bengal case, and in some cases in Punjab, ancestors converted to Islam at the hands of or through the blessings of the mazar of such and such Sufis. And Sufi literature itself from the 14th, 15th, 16th century is making this claim that Islam has spread in the subcontinent in different parts because of the blessed presence of the Sufis who settled in particular places. Now this, but more than conversion, what Sufis did is to create conditions where communities would emerge which would be syncretic communities, in the sense that they would neither be Muslims nor Hindus in the hardened identity kind often we are confronted with. This also brings us to a situation where bhakti movements also created the making of such communities. Though we know that even bhakti could be taking the political form sometime. What we notice in the 15th, 16th century North Indian Sufi bhakti complex is that how the bhakti movements were led by devotional poets and reformers from lower sections of society. They condemned religious rituals, they criticized caste or jati-based hierarchies and discrimination. Kabir kind of figures were very important. So were Nanak, and then other low caste saints like Raziuddin. They criticized caste or jati-based hierarchies and discriminations, and advocated the need to discover Ram, a formless God, and therefore Nirgun tradition, inside one's heart. Some traditions of bhakti also counterpoised as Hindu religious movements revolving around Shri Ram of Ayodhya as an epitome of virtues and juxtaposed with forms of popular Islamic spirituality or Sufism, as an answer to Sufism in the popular domain, as it were. However, in general, Ram Bhakti was not necessarily induced by Islamic presence historically. Ram Katha, I mentioned Padmavat, and there are many texts which are referring to Ram Katha already in the 16th century in the North Indian case. And Ram Katha in its varied dimensions have been discussed in a fine collection of essays recently published by Pavlu Pandyadhar, who is a colleague in the University History Department. So those saint poets and religious leaders such as Sant Kabir and Guru Nanak transcended contentious political boundaries of Islam and Hinduism. Religious fields were often scarred by violent formations of communities. The sons and gurus were involved in a competitive spirituality of sorts and often fed off each other, appropriating ideas and attracting followers, not necessarily to organize them as warring communities or sects, panths and sampradayas, and yet it happened. And there were figures like Kabir and Nanak would be combating those hardened boundaries around their teachings, and yet perhaps they did not succeed in what exactly they were aiming for. And yet in the Sufi Bhakti complex of medieval India, there was no difference in addressing the formless God with a variety of names they gave. And we know Allah, or Ram, or Rahim, or Khuda, or Alak Niranjan. I mentioned Abdul Quddus Gangohi in the 15th century, Chishti, Sabri, branch, who wrote in Hindi poetry and styling himself with the pen name Alak Das, and claimed that Vadatul Wajud and Advait philosophy kind of monism is no different, and therefore unity of God and unity of existence could be often emphasized simultaneously. Subsequently, Kabir searched for common grounds through the unity of God, Wahdatul Wajood, and not necessarily Tawheed. Unity of God in the Tawheed sense can be seen in his claim of the possibility of complete assimilation of both the Creator and creations. Let me quickly quote this line from him. Khaliq khalaq, Khaliq khalaq, khalaq mein khaliq, sab ghat rahiyo samai. And then he would also proclaim that kahe Kabir ek Ram japhure, Hindu tu rakna koi. Ek Ram japhure, Hindu tu rakna koi. But Kabir was very, very sharply critical of many of the Muslim practices, especially by the late 15th century. This beef eating had become a big controversial matter, and Kabir is very critical of that. Bakri murgi kin farmaya, kiske kahe tum tu shuri chalaya. And then he would say that din ko roja rahat hai, raat hanat hai kaye. And there are many such verses attributed by him, which is for advocating for vegetarianism, and especially the issues around beef eating. So it is when spiritual and political ideas of Ram or one God get conflated that the matter becomes a hotly contested identity question. The numerically stronger and politically resourceful communities or sects can strengthen their boundary markers and also subsume smaller ones with or without violence. I do not know how much time I have, but maybe I'll be heading towards conclusion quickly to say that how there are many examples from the careers of such Sufis and sons who are attacking orthodoxy and yet at the same time trying to unite people into a peaceful, respectful coexistence of each other. Many examples can be given from Muinuddin Chishti's career, many from Nizamuddin Aulia's, and to suggest that both the political and cultural were concerned about this possibility of how peaceful coexistence of a wide diversity of the people is only the way forward. And if religious sentiments and beliefs of the people run into trouble with the political ideals, then the political ideals have to be emphasized, and state, the political has to maintain equidistance from the warring sampradayas and sects and panths, etc., for creating conditions for peaceful coexistence of people. So as Islam and Muslim political power spread to India through a long and slow process of over 5 or 6 centuries, Muhammad bin Qasim's conquest of Sindh in 711 and 12 is often referred to, and the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in 1205, 500 years later, is the other major landmarks. Coming of the Mughals is a third, perhaps 18th century, immediately prior to the colonial conquest is another, and majority non-Muslims during this period of the pre-colonial, medieval and early modern under Muslim rulers were accorded the similar status as the people of the book, protected people of the book, like Jews and Christians of the Arab world and Zoroastrians of Iran, which were ancient communities of people with scriptures of their own. So after the conquest of Sindh, and subsequently, we know that Hindus were also referred to in the Muslim Sultanate as people of the book, who are protected people and therefore zimmis, and they could be giving jizya, and that was a discriminatory tax. Jizya, and live peacefully in the Sultanate, which would mean that some kind of minoritization, etc., of a large majority would be happening in terms of power relations. So therefore, at the same time, we know that non-Muslims, Rajput subsequent from the 16th century and wherever, a large number of non-Muslims could be seen as part of the bureaucracy of Muslim political regimes. Not only Akbar, under Akbar in the late 16th century, but also even under Aurangzeb in the late 17th century. In fact, Rajput percentage of Rajput nobility under Aurangzeb would be much higher than compared to what it was under Akbar. So as the Mughal state began to crumble from the last decades of the 17th century, though the actual process of decline and fall of the empire took an incredible 150 years. Remember, Aurangzeb died in 1707, and Bahadur Shah was removed, following the failure of the 1857 revolt. 150 years. Religion was used in some cases to mobilize support against the Mughals. Sikhs and Satnamis come to mind straight away in the 18th century. Jats have had their own ways to press for their demands, and yet the majority non-Muslims were self-assured of their place in the universe. Not only traditional scripture-bound way of life was available to them, but also those wanting to question the operation embedded in them had the freedom to do that, as in the case of Bhakti movements, of the kind, the language of the kind Kabir spoke, with political regimes maintaining critical distance in the secular sense in which modern state is required to maintain equidistance and place itself above religious or sectarian lobbies, even though escaping away from religion was not possible. But managing traditions was, in terms of the way Sikandar Lodi managed this issue of handling Kabir and figures like Rai Das, who were being attacked by the Orthodox, telling them that let them do their work, you do your own, mind your own business, as it were. Regarding developing a consensus for peaceful community relations and identification of Hindus as people of the book, several efforts were made by scholars, Sufis and sultans and their sons and officials to develop common ground and identify a language and idiom aimed at a scripturally validated position of the essential unity of humanity. And that's why invocation to Vedanta and broader Sufi, philosophy of Wahdatul Wujud, etc. Following this line, attempts were also made through the medieval period to show that religious leaders of Hindus, Brahmins, may have descended from Abraham, phonetically, Brahmins, Abraham, a prophet familiar to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Indeed, Brahma sounded like Abraham, much as Ram and Rahim could be considered as equivalent. Even if the historical and political links between these religions and their followers, whether Zoroastrians or Hindus, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and not to forget Buddhists and Jains, could be tenuous, but it is significant that these people, along with a number of other sects and communities with traditions and customary practices of their own, could try to live peacefully as people of the same God, and with ways crisscrossing to achieve him. There are different ways to achieve God, is what Hindu Turak Samvad of Eknath is telling in one of the dramas, rather than attacking each other on the basis of practice. Indeed, the attempts by important figures like in 17th century Mughals, Darashiko to see parallels and connections between the notion of pantheism in Upanishadic Advait, non-dualism, and Sufic Wahdatul Wujud, monism, or unity of being, were not desperate attempt to hold on to the possibility of peaceful coexistence. There were valid theoretical grounds for religious, spiritual, philosophical grounds for that. So prominent stands, in conclusion, prominent stands of Sufism in medieval and early modern India, which we have discussed quickly and in passing, were Sharia compliant ways to acquire knowledge about the truth relating to the loving God. So Sufi mystic path or tariqat is about Shariat and tariqat and marifat and haqiqat. Shariat is the domain of the theology, law based on Quran and traditions of the Prophet, etc. And the mystic path, that is about knowing God, and that marifat is about the spiritual knowledge of the existence of the unity of God, and the haqiqat is the truth of that existence. Now, it was believed that it was possible to achieve this through renunciation from the materialism of the world love and devotion for God, purification of the lower self, which is referred to as tazkiya-e-nafs, and cultivation of the heart. Also, meditational practices beyond ritual prayers and service to humanity. And service to humanity is especially very, very important, referred to as khidmat-e-khalq, because the khalq, the creation, is the creation of God. There, and if a love for God can be expressed in these by servicing, serving the people. So their charisma ensured that the Sufis' charisma ensured that the Thursday evening visitors to the shrine included rulers, ministers, politicians, bureaucrats, thugs, criminals, rich and poor. All kinds of people can be seen gathered at Sufi shrines. Women in large numbers. Generally, women are not being allowed to enter mosques and graveyards, but women are welcome at Sufi shrines. Transgenders. Boundaries and barriers are broken. All are equal in the eyes of the saint and his Lord, creating a sacred space for peaceful coexistence, indeed respectful coexistence of all the diversity and plurality, which is the hallmark of our society, with an inclusive political culture, with the idea of welfare and justice for all. I think I will be stopping now, and I can take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aquil, for introducing us to so many different aspects of Sufism that we were unaware of. We'll take a few questions. Whoever is interested in asking a question can unmute themselves and ask the question, or you can type in your question in the chat box and I can read it out.
Well, if no one is asking, I'd like to
please go ahead.
I'd like to congratulate Professor Aquil on a very fascinating talk. And I'd really like to hear a little more about what came across to me as a kind of a hierarchy between the written word, as in poetry. I'm talking of the kind of hierarchization that seems to emerge from his discussion on Sama between the written word or poetry, vocal voice, that is vocal music, and then instrumental music. And I was wondering if this had anything to do with clarity or simplicity of or purity of thought in its less embellished state being preferred, or is there some other rationale to that?
This is an important question, and I have to do a lot of thinking about where it is coming from in terms of the figures like Nizamuddin, as I was mentioning, that in his circle of large followers of different kinds, both the popular but also very closely associated figures like Amir Khusro. We know that instruments are being deployed in music, which is creating conditions for the qawwals to warm up and then sing their poetry of love. So for qawwals and for figures like Amir Khusro, there is no contradiction actually. That but in the theological debates, of the kind that Nizamuddin had to indulge in facing the inquest, that how mazami instruments are required or not, and the tradition says that it is not required. The word, the poetry is important in itself, and the accompaniments of the instruments are not required. There might be deeper reasons also within history of music and within history of poetical traditions. But I think this much is very, very clear, that in the orthodox in the sense of conforming to the to juridical school, not so much Hanafi school, but in this case, actually, Nizamuddin was adhering to Shafi'i kind of position. This clarity was very much there that instruments are mazamir, as they are referred to. Mazamir are not required. Even women are not required, in the sense that Sufi music, which is a politically incorrect thing to say, that in Qawwali sessions of the kind Nizamuddin Auliya organized, women were not part of it. Women can be outside of it. There might be some barriers there, and yet the news is, and the report is from the 14th century, that women had taken very heavily to mysticism, Sufism, and women could also be participating in Mahfil Samar Qawwali. So both instruments and the presence of women were not approved of, and yet they were part of the practice. There might be other, I will think about it and maybe articulate my answer better than I do. Maybe other reasons also of how the vocal is to be privileged over instrumental. Was there a competition in terms of sound? Sometimes sound of the unheard kind also, because there are discussion about that also in Sufi Bhakti traditions.
I think there are no more questions or clarification. So we'd like to thank Professor Aquil for this wonderful, insightful lecture on Sufism, and we hope to have you again in one of our other sessions. Thank you so much, Professor Aquil, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.